Hello everybody, I hope the break was fine and you met lots of nice people. Please welcome Oren Razon, and he will be telling us about how to perfectly train our production model. Retrain.
Good, thanks Oren. So I'm Ofer. Unfortunately, Oren lost his voice. He's here for the Q&A, but I'm going to run the session. And what I want to talk about is actually to share with you some perspectives and some of our experience in the market in dealing with retraining. We're not going to talk about Oren and his family, although we are brothers, so I can talk about his family. But what we, both of us and the team, is really in love with is to deal with the dark side of AI and machine learning, which is dealing with the production. Dealing with live systems that actually run AI and machine learning. And in many cases, we find that to be the dark side of the industry because not many people really know how to do it right. We started Superwise a year ago, and our focus with Superwise is to help people deal with the production side, making sure that things work well, things work as expected, with the ability to explain, and make sure that you're safe and these models run properly when you use them in production. What we find out, and that's many years of experience, and definitely since we started Superwise and we work with customers, is that models degrade in performance when they go live. Quick question, how many of you guys here use machine learning and AI models in production? Most of you. How many of you relate to that statement? Most of you. That's fantastic. Good. So let's talk about the why. Let's talk about the why, but actually before that, let's start with a light approach to explain the why. If I would go in Tel Aviv a few years ago and I will tell you, hey, look, there's a bird. That's a different meaning than what you can probably process when I'm going to tell you that today. The same in that room, we can talk about bird, right? If I'm telling the word bird now, most of you will think about this amazing neural network for NLP and less about this cute doll. But that wasn't the case a few years ago. Now, why is that? Because we live in a world that things constantly change. Things change. And that's a great introduction to this term in the industry called concept drift. Concept drift basically says that since things change, then when you train your model and when you build your model, then reality was in a specific situation. And that's where the demarcation line were crossed. Now, over time, it might be that things change. And if you still treat your environment with the same demarcation line, you're going to make mistakes. Why? Because the same demarcation line is no longer valid for the new distribution of the data. And that's in a very, very high-level view. That's what we call a concept drift. Now, concept drifts happen for many reasons. In some cases, it's the business, the reality that is changed. New segments in the market start to use your service or approach you to ask for loans. New type of customers try to run transactions. That's the changing reality of the business. In other cases, the models themselves change the behavior of your market. And the new reality is not longer the reality that was when you built your model. In many cases, and probably you guys will relate to that, there are technical changes. Someone changed the API. Someone from the engineering side did an upgrade and the data comes in with nulls. Right? People relate to that? Yeah, I see many people know their head. That's reality. The last thing that we start to see in the market as well, adversarial attacks. People send you the wrong data to lead you to the wrong decisions. And that's another thing that you see in the market. So the bottom line is that when you operate machine learning and AI models in production, you need to put a lot of care, a lot of love, and then a lot of attention to these models. Now, those that raise their hand with saying that they have machine learning and AI in production, How many of you have a very clear strategy for retraining your models? Oh, come on. Huh? A clear definition, I don't know, policy, when do you retrain your models? Man, I need some more because usually the magic number is 80%. So I assume that more of you do that, you just didn't participate here. But what we see is that 80% of the people that we talk with are doing something, usually ad hoc, and only 20%, like yourself, have a very clear policy in several degrees of automation. Okay, but 80% of the people that we talk with, they don't know what, or they don't have any clear strategy or any clear policy for retraining the models. So let's deep dive into what does it take. By the way, do you know what is, do you know this institute, IST? I said that. Okay. So the questions about when should you retrain your models? The question about when to retrain your models, we put three main questions around retraining. The first is, how often should you retrain? The second, which data do you use when you retrain? And the third is, how deep do you go when you retrain your models? Let's go one by one. Two very common, very naive approaches regarding the when question are these. First approach says, let's assume that the business and the environment behaves in a quite systematic and quite consistent behavior. And let's decide that every 3 weeks, every 3 months, every 2 days, whatever your business is, you're going to retrain because that's when you see the cycles that require retraining. The second approach says, if it works, don't fix it. Let's wait for something to break, and then we'll retrain. Right? Two very naive, very common approaches. Let's talk about the pitfalls. Okay, that's in terms of time. Okay. The first approach is generally fantastic when things really behave in a consistent and expected way. But what happens if on the third period, suddenly, one of your competitors launch a new campaign to the market, or even your own business department launch a new campaign to new customers that weren't there before? Things that happen in life, suddenly this period is irrelevant anymore for retraining. And this constant retraining, not only that will not be effective, it will lead to very bad results because you will take this period of time and you will apply it moving forward, which shouldn't be the case. So that's a pitfall for the first approach. The pitfall for the second approach is even worse because you assume that you get to know that you have a problem when you see the drop of results. And it might be the case if you're running a real-time bidder for click-through optimizations. It might be the case that in just a few minutes, you get to see that you have a problem. In most cases, it will take you days, weeks, and even months before you know that you have a problem. Sometimes you don't even have the feedback loop, but even if you have the feedback loop, to know that your marketing campaign was not effective, to know that the fraud detection didn't work well because a few weeks later you find out that you had a lot of cashbacks. You name it, a lot of use cases. Usually it takes time for the feedback to come in for you to realize that you have a problem. So that's the pitfall of waiting to this wait-and-see approach that is not, it might be good for some cases, very reactive approach, but not very efficient over time. Second question, which data to use? And there's always a trade-off here. If you take too little data or just the recent data, you might be overfitted. If you take too long, then you might lose some phenomena, and you might be irrelevant for the latest period. What we found out is that you just need to treat it as yet another hyperparameter in your training. Okay, and as you do with all the features that you want, take the depth of the data as yet another hyperparameter that you use and optimize that across your experiments. In that case, you see that the best result, and this is based on some real cases, the best result was somewhere in the middle. Okay, but we talk about the recency of the data for the training. We talk about different approaches for that, but we realize that it's not good enough. We realize that it's not good enough because all these approaches are quite naive, and we were sure that there's a better way to get real-time indication that you need to do retraining, but not only that, but also get to know how to do this retraining right. And the basic approach that we saw in front of our eyes when we started that, saying that as long as the data that you use for training is similar to the data that you run in production, then you should be okay. But how do you define data similarity? Do you have a clear answer, a very clear scientific answer on what is similar data? And that's when we started to explore around that. And the first thing that we did was develop a clustering approach. We took an unsupervised approach, we took the feature space, and we built some clusters of the features of the data. And then we took data from, in this example, day 1. We took data from day 2. We tried to analyze, are these the same? And suddenly we got a quantified answer in this approach, whether the data sets are similar. In that case, they are not similar. And that was a very useful approach, and we use this approach in many cases, but this is not the only approach that we use. Another approach says, let's take a supervised approach. Let's build a classifier that, taking sets of data, this classifier will try to say whether this data is from day 1 or day 2. Now, if this classifier works well, then what it means? That the data is different. And that's what we built. And that's another very pragmatic approach to analyze whether your data is similar or not. But even that wasn't enough, because then we found out that there's a lot of noise. Data is changing all the time. So we added another layer on the entrance saying not all the data is the same. And we built this embedding layer that practically takes into account only the data that really matters for the model. Okay? We use some uncertainty analysis in order to understand which data point really matters for the algorithm, and we embed the features that come in a way that only the data that matters gets into this classifier. So only if data that matters is changed in a way that is significant enough, then you know that you have an issue. And then we use this classifier, and we take this classifier, and we analyze the AUC of this classifier. And using this formula, we get to this quantified number of how similar the data is between days. Now, we take this data. Now, bear with me, because now there's going to be a very detailed view here. We take this data, and we compare days versus days. If we try to visualize that, it looks like that. Okay, so the matrix here says that the axes are day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, and day 1, day 2. So it's day versus day. Green says data between day X and day Y are pretty much the same. That's why the diagonal line is so green. Red says they are totally different, and yellow is somewhere in the middle. Okay, all of you got the idea of this scheme? No. Actually, since it's symmetric, we can actually look only on that. The black, this solid line says this is the training period. Now, you noticed that there is a dramatic change here. This is data from one of our live customers. Okay? Something happened. By the way, in that case, an API of one of the backend system changed. They didn't know about that on time, and there was a sudden change of the taxonomy of the data. Major change. By the way, this is a retrospective analysis that we did, and that suddenly they realized why they had a drop in performance in that period. Do you see other things in that diagram? Do you see another phenomenon? And just to be fair, this one, fantastic. Yeah, this one. If you look at the training data set that they used, they took a very naive approach. They took the 12 weeks of data to train their model. But apparently, in this training period, they had a whole period that is not exactly similar to the real life, that is different. And actually, they got a lot of noise into their training period. Good catch. And that's when we realized that we can, in a way, annotate what is a similar data and build a whole new approach to picking which data do you take when you retrain your models. Just in terms of time, fantastic. Okay. So we build this flowchart saying, okay, how do we choose data that we train? So the inference goes as usual, but as the inference goes, we also look at the data that flows in, and besides just storing it and using it, it evolves. Wait, so don't take a picture yet. Just still animation. Besides storing the data, we constantly analyze the similarity of the data. And if we see that there is too big of a change, then we purify this data set. We take these anomalies out, and we clean the data, and we collect enough data for that to be sufficient for retraining. Sorry. If not, if data is quite similar, then we keep aggregating data that is similar enough until we have enough data for retraining. Clear. Some results from this real-life case, when we did this optimization, we were actually able to, just by doing this initial exercise, we were able to improve the performance of the model by 3.6%. But then we didn't stop there. We said, wait a second, we are all for diversity. So we took a stochastic approach, and we will not dive into that right now, but we said, okay, so now we know which data is similar and which data is different. Let's take enough similar data, but let's also pick some different data. And that was an amazing analysis that we did, and we got to even much better results. Just by looking deeper into the data and understanding which data do you really need to use for retraining and which not. Again, remember that most people don't have any approach, don't have any policy, and if they do, it's usually quite naive. This is the opportunity, the initial opportunity that lies in optimizing all these live machine learning and AI models that all of us are using. Okay, next, there's always a question. How deep do you go when you retrain or re-optimize your models? And there's no clear answer here, but we wanted to put here the range. In some cases, you just do some optimization to your features. You change the moving averages, you do this and that, some minor corrections that are required from time to time. The next approach is to do this hyperparameter tuning and refitting your model, which is a bit more painful process, but it's still okay and even fantastic to automate. If you are in control regarding the data that you're using, that's a very, very important statement. The two other approaches are more dramatic approaches, let's say, but are very common. One is to actually do some reselection of the features. In some cases, even think about new data sets and new features that you can pour into your model. But even with the existing feature set, to reselect the features that you use, and all the way to actually build a whole new range of models, challenge your existing models with new ones, and even try to take different approaches, different strategies, and put a new model into production. Again, depends on the case. Super important eventually to make sure that you're in control, you're operating not in the blind, you're visible to what you're doing. You have the visibility to what you're doing in terms of when and which data to use. Okay, we're a bit ahead, but we'll have enough time for Q&A. Takeaways, and that's where that end this part of the session. Machine learning and AI in production is no magic. And people sometimes think, you know, I talk with a lot of people around the world, people think there is a magic, that if you put machine learning, it will just work. No, it doesn't. And it requires this continuous attention, continuous care, and retraining is a major thing of that. And the main thing is that you need to understand that you need to kind of expect the unexpected. Because again, if things will continue to work exactly as they did in the training environment, you're safe. But that's never the case. Never, never, never the case. I've never seen one case that this is relevant. Third, recency is not necessarily relevant. And that's what we've seen with the data sets and the similarity of the data. Super, super important. In order to scale your operations with AI, you need to automate stuff. Because what we did here, and the process that we took you through here, you can do when you have 100 models in production. You need to automate stuff, which is why we started Superwise originally. And when we said automation, it's not just let's put this script and put in the cron that every 3 weeks activate this script that does retraining. Make sure that it's not an afterthought. And remember that if you're not doing that correctly, expect damage. Expect damage, and eventually the business will look at that and we lose trust. And that's something that all of us don't want to happen. So with that, Oren, maybe join me for the Q&A. Hope that your voice will be sufficient for a few questions. Thank you.
So the question is, how do we choose the features to cluster, or how do we do this embedding layer, right? So generally, we can use the embedding layer that we suggested, both for the supervised and the unsupervised approach. How did we did this embedding layer was by building a competitor model. We took and tried to build, by using neural network, a model that will try to predict the same task as the task that our customer do, but then extracted the first few layers, like reduced the final layer of the neural network and took it only as an encoder, because then we know that these layers of the neural network encode us only the important part of the features that relate to the specific task of the model. Yeah, we are taking only getting rid of the last layer and use the neural network that we built as an encoder, yeah, to make sure that we are embedding into the importance feature space. Can you repeat the question? Regarding what? Changing performance or changing data? So changing data, I think that's what we are suggesting here. We are suggesting few approaches, and there are more. In the unsupervised approach, we are suggesting to look at the different distribution of the way that your data is clustered. And in a supervised approach, we're saying that if you can build a discriminator that could discriminate between two data sets, it means that he found some patterns that help you to recognize the difference between the two data sets. So each approach has its own pros and cons, but both of them are quite good because they are working on a multivariant perspective and not only on a per feature basis. Does it answer the question? Yeah.
Once you know what its data distribution is changing, what data
Yeah, so using the matrix that we presented, which we call data DNA, the nice thing is that instead of just saying, okay, data is changing, so basically in the traditional retraining strategy, you will say, okay, let's take last 2 weeks. So we're saying, no, recency doesn't really mean that it's the most relevant data set. What is the most relevant data set is the data set that is most similar to what you're currently experiencing. So we can search in the history where are those data annotations that look similar to the current distribution of data, because we are comparing each day to the history that we have. And we can take and leverage even further history to retrain our model. So if we can go back to the matrix. So for example, I could be in this place, and instead of including this period of time, which is really a different distribution, I will take only the similar days, which means I could leverage all this part of data, and automatically, by using the similarity threshold that we build, I will deprecate this history. But it's dynamic, meaning that here I could use this amount of history, and above I could use more history. It's only depend on how much that, history is really similar to what you're currently experiencing. Yes. So it depends of the task. If you're talking about recommendation system, so yes, because recommendation system, as we said, change reality. The machine learning think that I will love this movie, so it will offer it to me, and by definition, once he offers it to me, it will increase my chances to choose this movie. So in recommendation system or churn prediction or such similar tasks, yes, machine learning change reality. So those are really more difficult cases, but still we can use this approach to choose the most similar history that we have. But in many other cases, machine learning doesn't necessarily change the history by the fact that it was uploaded. Unless people in a manual process change totally what are the general features that we are using, yes? Currently, we are assuming that the feature space is still quite stable. Yeah. So you're saying, let's try to balance. Can you repeat the suggestion?
For example, I may be training on images taken in my lab, and then going out to the field, it looks a bit different, but I can do some easy transformations on the production images to cause them to look more like, and this is very cheap, right? Because it's only some kind of pre-processing on the data.
Yeah, so of course that if you know what type of pre-processing you could do on your data, that will make him look similar to what you're currently experiencing. So yeah, that's a good and very valuable approach. But in our case, we're talking about, and I think it's a bit different in images, because maybe in images you know what you're currently experiencing in the field, which is not in your lab. But in our case, we don't know what we will experience in production. So it's like the opposite way. We're saying, I don't know what to expect, so let's see what I currently see, and let's search for relevant history that looks similar to that. Okay, so cool. So we can take it later. Yeah. Thank you.